The daughter of a woman accused in a gruesome murder in Prince George's County takes the stand.
Candace Craig is charged with killing and dismembering her own mother. Her daughter testified today, recounting what her mother allegedly told her to do to help dispose of her grandmother's body.
A 4 to 6 year old woman murdered her own 71-year-old mother. The woman who housed her, fed her, paid her bills, then took a chainsaw to her body, grilled her remains on a barbecue, and used seasoning to mask the smell. All of it for a pension check, for Social Security money, for credit cards she wasn't supposed to be touching. And when the police knocked on that door 10 days later, she answered it, smiled, let them in, and stood right there while they walked into that basement. The proof: court documents, a daughter's own testimony, over 600 pieces of forensic evidence, and audio recordings of Margaret Craig's own voice, calling her bank, confused and frightened, trying to figure out why her money kept disappearing. Margaret Craig, 71 years old, was a hard-working woman who had spent her entire life doing the right thing. She collected her pension. She collected her Social Security. She opened her home to her grown daughter, her grandchildren, and even her daughter's boyfriend. She had nothing left to prove to anyone. She had earned her peace. And on May 23, 2023, in her own home on Hill Road in Prince George's County, Maryland, the person she trusted most in this world took that peace from her, permanently. Her daughter, Candace Craig, had been stealing from her for months. Credit card fraud, pension theft, Social Security money rerouted. And prosecutors say that the moment Margaret found out and threatened to go to the police, that was her death sentence. How does a 71-year-old woman confronting her daughter about stolen money turn into one of the most horrifying murders in Prince George's County history? This is the Margaret Craig case. Subscribe to Crime Shadows and stay with me, because this one is going to shake you.
She always screamed, like when she was to fall and stuff, she would always scream. So, and we found a dismembered body. Do you know what dismembered means? Okay, so we found pieces of her body, pieces like chopped up, like somebody's body was chopped up, in bags in the house. I can't say for sure that it's your grandmother. I don't know whose body it is. I don't know who else's body would be in the house. She went missing twice last year, and then January she did the same thing.
Was there a report for that?
No, she came back the third day, but she never said who she was or anything. And I kept on asking, she didn't want to tell me.
Let me tell you who Margaret Craig actually was, because she deserves that. She deserves more than just being a victim in a headline. Margaret Craig was 71 years old, and by all accounts, she was the kind of woman who kept entire families standing. She had worked hard her whole life, long enough that she had earned a pension on top of her Social Security benefits. That combination, modest as it was, became the financial backbone of the household she shared with her daughter Candace, Candace's daughter Celia Hardy, and Candace's live-in boyfriend. Margaret Craig was not just a mother. She was a provider. She was a roof. She was the reason those lights stayed on. And she did it willingly. Prosecutors described her as giving, caring, and compassionate. A woman who, even in her 70s, was still showing up for people who should have been showing up for her. She had no reason to suspect that the person eating her food and sleeping under her roof had been quietly bleeding her dry. But something started to feel wrong. Margaret had begun to notice discrepancies. Money that wasn't where it should be. Charges she didn't recognize. And rather than confronting Candace right away, she did what a lot of older people do. She called her bank. Prosecutors played those call recordings in open court, and hearing them is gutting. Margaret Craig's voice on those recordings is frustrated, confused, a little scared. "I don't have money to pay my bills," she said. She was trying to protect herself through the proper channels. She was trying to fix the problem the right way. What she didn't know was that Candace was already one step ahead. Prosecutors also played audio in court of what sounded like Candace Craig impersonating her mother, calling the bank, trying to move money, trying to stay ahead of the trail Margaret was starting to follow. At some point between those phone calls and May 23rd, Margaret Craig found out exactly what was happening. And she did what any mother would do. She confronted her daughter. She said enough. She said she was going to the police. That conversation, that confrontation in that house, is the last thing Margaret Craig ever did. Did she know, when she looked her daughter in the eye and said those words, what was coming next? Did she have any idea that the woman standing across from her had already decided she was more valuable as a continuing source of income than as a living, breathing mother? How does trusting your own child turn into a death sentence? Now let me tell you about Candace Craig, because I want you to understand who she was before we get to what she did. Candace Craig was 44 years old at the time of the murder. She was living in her mother's house on Hill Road in the Walker Mill area of Prince George's County, Maryland. She was not paying rent. She was not managing the household. By the picture that prosecutors painted at trial, Candace Craig was a woman who had positioned herself to take, from her mother, from the system, from anyone who trusted her. Her live-in boyfriend, a man named Benny, described during trial as a drug dealer, was also living in that house. Margaret Craig, the 71-year-old, was providing for all of them. Candace had no documented prior criminal history that made headlines. She was just a daughter, a mother, a woman living with family. But underneath that surface, according to prosecutors, she had been running a quiet but devastating financial fraud against her own mother for an extended period. She was using Margaret's credit cards fraudulently. She was stealing from her pension. She was diverting Social Security payments. And somewhere along the way, prosecutors say she had also started to calculate what would happen if that money kept coming in after Margaret was gone. Think about that for a second. That is not a crime of passion. That is not a snap decision. The plan to dismember Margaret's body, to cut her up so that the checks would keep coming in, suggests this was a woman who had already begun thinking about her mother's death as a financial solution. When Margaret made those calls to the bank, she was unknowingly starting a clock. When she confronted Candace, she stopped it. According to court documents, Candace Craig attacked her mother after Margaret threatened to report her to the police for fraudulent use of her credit card. The state's attorney later said Margaret was asphyxiated, strangled, by her own daughter. And then, and I need you to really sit with this, then Candace Craig went and got a chainsaw. Was this something that had been building for years? Was the greed always there, just waiting for an opportunity? Or was there a single moment on May 23rd when something in Candace Craig broke loose and never came back? Who was Candace Craig? Really? And were there warning signs that everyone around her missed? Now we get to the crime itself. And I have to warn you, this section is not easy. But Margaret Craig deserves for the full truth to be told. On May 23rd, 2023, sometime during the day, Candace Craig attacked her 71-year-old mother inside their shared home on Hill Road. State's attorney Aisha Braveboy later told reporters, and the courtroom, that Margaret Craig was asphyxiated. She was strangled to death by her own daughter, in her own home, in the house she had opened up and paid for. The defense, at trial, tried to argue that they had no idea how Margaret Craig died. They built an entire PowerPoint around the concept of reasonable doubt. But the prosecution had something far more powerful, a witness who was in that house. A witness who heard Margaret Craig scream. That witness was Celia Hardy, Candace Craig's own 19-year-old daughter, Margaret's granddaughter. Celia testified that she heard her grandmother scream on May 23rd. She testified that afterward, her mother told her she had killed Margaret because Margaret had found out about the stealing and was going to the police.
Like a little table with one of the umbrellas. They had that out there. They had the grill. And then they had, the charcoal and stuff like that.
And then she testified to what happened next. And this is where the case goes from horrifying to something else entirely. The next day, Celia found her grandmother. Not in the living room. Not in the bedroom. Celia Hardy discovered her grandmother's remains inside a blue bin, in her own bedroom, with a trash bag over her head. Let that land for a moment. A 19-year-old girl, already living in a house full of dysfunction and fear, woke up and found her grandmother's body stored in her room. And according to prosecutors, Candace Craig then told her daughter what they were going to do next. They were going to cut up the body. They were going to burn it. Prosecutors say Candace Craig used a chainsaw that was later recovered from the basement with human remains still on it, to dismember her mother's body. The chief medical examiner's office received 9 bags and several paint cans of remains related to this case. 9 bags. From one 71-year-old woman. But Candace Craig wasn't done. She and Celia then took those remains and tried to burn them on a barbecue grill behind the house. And according to testimony at trial, they used seasoning, actual seasoning, to try to mask the smell of burning human remains. A neighbor noticed a small fire in the brush behind the house on May 27th and called 911. But when crews arrived, they couldn't locate the fire. Nobody connected the dots yet. Celia Hardy later testified that her mother sent her to buy supplies, a gas can, charcoal, a lighter. Celia has a developmental disability. Prosecutors noted she was easily coerced. She was 19 years old, living in her grandmother's house, and her mother had just committed an act of unspeakable violence. She did what her mother told her to do. Meanwhile, the bags. The trash bags that didn't make it to the grill were stashed in that basement. Blood spatter was throughout the room. Cutting utensils were left behind. Cleaning materials were present. The chainsaw sat there with its evidence still attached. And Candace Craig kept answering the phone. Kept going about whatever counted as her daily routine. Kept the social security checks coming. What were Margaret Craig's final moments like? What did she think in those last seconds when she realized her own daughter was the danger? What could possibly make a human being look at their mother, and decide to do this? If you were that neighbor who saw the smoke and called 911 on May 27th, and you knew what was actually burning, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments. On June 2nd, 2023, 10 days after Margaret Craig was murdered, Prince George's County police officers responded to the 200 block of Hill Road in Hyattsville for a welfare check. The call came in just after 1:30 in the afternoon. A relative, a man who said he had not been able to reach Margaret for several days, was worried about her welfare. When officers arrived, Candace Craig answered the door. She let them in. She walked them through the house. And then they went downstairs. According to police and court documents, officers entering the basement immediately noticed the smell of decomposition. They saw blood and tissue on the floor near 3 white plastic trash bags. When they looked into one of the open bags, they found what appeared to be brain matter and dismembered human remains. A forensic investigator was called to the scene and confirmed the bags contained the remains of a human being. Investigators immediately recognized this was not an accident. This was not a natural death. This was a murder scene, and a crime scene that someone had tried, very deliberately, to destroy. Within the basement, detectives also recovered a chainsaw cover, cutting utensils, cleaning materials, and blood spatter throughout the space. When the chainsaw itself was seized, investigators reported that human remains were still on it. Candace Craig was taken into custody, and so was Celia Hardy. The first story Candace Craig offered, the one she gave before detectives started laying out what they had found, didn't hold up. According to body camera video released during the trial, Candace tried to blame the chemicals found in the basement on Celia, claiming they were from a spill Hardy had made. But detectives had the forensic evidence. They had the chainsaw. They had the bags. And they had Celia Hardy herself, who, facing her own serious charges, eventually cooperated fully with prosecutors. Celia Hardy pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and agreed to testify against her mother. And when she took that stand, she was described by reporters in the courtroom as matter-of-fact, calm, like she was describing something she had processed deeply and painfully over months and months. She told the jury exactly what she saw, exactly what she heard, exactly what her mother told her to do, and then she told them about the blue bin, about the trash bag, about the grill. The prosecution also had the audio recordings of Margaret Craig calling her bank. They had audio that appeared to capture Candace impersonating her mother to move money. They had over 600 pieces of evidence in total. Forensic evidence, photographs, testimony, and the chainsaw. The defense tried. They pointed at Benny, the live-in boyfriend. They asked how a man living in that small house could have had no knowledge of what happened. They pushed reasonable doubt. But the prosecution had Celia Hardy. And Celia Hardy had been there. State's attorney Aisha Braveboy described the case as having rocked the entire region. The lead prosecutor, Assistant State's Attorney Shauna Coleman, told the courtroom and press that the case felt personally devastating to her. She had recently lost her own mother. How do you explain away a chainsaw with human remains on it? How do you explain a 71-year-old woman's body stored in 9 bags and paint cans? What was going through Candace Craig's mind the morning after the murder, when she walked past that basement and went about her day? On November 1st, 2024, after an 8-day trial, the jury came back with their verdict. They found Candace Craig guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and disposing of a body in an unauthorized place. The jury did not deliberate long. Celia Hardy's testimony, combined with the mountain of forensic evidence, made it swift. The courtroom heard those call recordings of Margaret Craig's voice. They saw over 600 pieces of evidence. Photographs were shown that were reportedly so graphic that at least one person was observed leaving the courtroom. State's Attorney Aisha Braveboy spoke directly to reporters after the verdict. She called Margaret Craig a special victim. She described what had been done to her as insulting, a word that feels both too small and exactly right. She said Margaret Craig was a hard-working woman, a woman who collected what she had earned, a woman who provided for her grown daughter, her grandchildren, her daughter's boyfriend, a woman who was killed, dismembered, and grilled by the person she loved and housed and fed. Braveboy also stated clearly that what Candace Craig had done to her mother was heartless. A daughter who was supposed to be caring for her aging mother had instead stolen from her and then murdered her the moment Margaret tried to protect herself. The defense had argued they had no idea how Margaret died. The jury disagreed, completely and quickly. As for Celia Hardy, Judge Karen Mason sentenced her to 5 years of supervised probation at a December 2024 hearing. Hardy had already been in custody for over 500 days since her arrest. Prosecutors acknowledged her cooperation as critical to the conviction. Court officials noted her developmental disability and the fact that she had been easily coerced by her mother. Braveboy said in a statement that it was unthinkable that a mother would put her own children in that position, that Candace Craig had not only murdered her mother but had attempted to blame Hardy and her other children for the crime. Celia Hardy walked out of that courtroom, onto probation, back into a world her mother had shattered for her. Does Candace Craig deserve any sympathy for any reason? Drop your thoughts below. What sentence is justice for what was done to Margaret Craig? As of February 2025, Candace Craig was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will never leave a prison cell. That is the outcome. That is the legal conclusion. But I want to spend a moment on what this case leaves behind, because Margaret Craig was more than a case file. Margaret Craig leaves behind family members who have, according to reports, chosen not to speak publicly. I respect that. Because what do you say? What language exists for this? Your grandmother, the woman who worked her whole life, who kept a roof over everyone's heads, who called her bank confused and frightened because someone she loved was stealing from her, is gone. Not just gone. Gone in the most violent, dehumanizing way imaginable. The state's attorney's office said Margaret Craig was a giving, caring, loving, compassionate woman. She provided for her grown daughter. She provided for her grandchildren. She even provided for a boyfriend who wasn't her responsibility. And in the end, none of that protection was extended back to her. None of that care came back around. The community felt it. This case, Braveboy said, rocked the entire region. And when a case like this surfaces, a case that lives inside the family, inside the home, it forces everyone to reckon with something uncomfortable. Because the danger in this story wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a random act. It was someone Margaret Craig looked at every single day and loved. There is also the question of what we still don't know. We know the financial motive. We know the timeline. We know the mechanics of the crime in brutal detail. But does financial desperation, even desperation tangled up with years of dependency and resentment, explain this level of violence? Does it explain a chainsaw? Does it explain a grill? Does it explain seasoning? Psychologists and criminologists may weigh in on what creates that kind of rupture in a person. But for Margaret Craig's family, no clinical explanation will ever fill the space she left behind. And this case also raises broader questions about financial elder abuse, a crime that is dramatically underreported and often invisible until it's too late. Margaret Craig was doing everything right. She noticed. She called the bank. She confronted the problem. And it killed her. There are thousands of Margaret Craigs out there right now, in homes across this country, trying to figure out why their money keeps disappearing, too afraid or too heartbroken to believe the person doing it is the person sleeping down the hall. Could this have been stopped? What does justice even look like when someone does this to the woman who raised them? What would you do if this was your family? Subscribe to Crime Shadows for more cases that reveal the darkness hiding in plain sight. Subscribe to Crime Shadows, because the most dangerous stories aren't the ones that happen to strangers. They are the ones that happen at home.